So I've decided to make a narrated Prezi for my identity project. And my choice of medium is significant for a couple of reasons. So I wanted to do some sort of a PowerPoint or a lecture type of method of communicating, because I'm a teacher and I identify very strongly as being a teacher, and teachers do a lot of PowerPoints. But I wanted to do something that was a little bit more technologically savvy, maybe, or interactive, or cutting edge than just a PowerPoint, because I also identify as being an innovator in my field. And so actually the software that I'm using for this right now is called EasyVid, and I've never used the software before, and that's kind of indicative of me. I'm always trying to try new technologies and new softwares and new methods in my teaching. And I also really like this Prezi because I liked the template that is this particular option. So you can see here we have a polar bear standing on an iceberg, and for me the image really evokes the far north, and I do very much identify as being a Canadian and someone from the north. And I like the idea of the image of the iceberg because in talking about identity, I realized going through this project and kind of this process of looking at my own identity is that there's things that we can see on the surface. So those are the tip of the iceberg, but there's an awful lot of what makes up our identity is made up of hidden factors, things that are not so visible to those around us, and that, of course, is the rest of the iceberg and the bit that probably sank the Titanic. So as we learned in class, our identity is based on internal and external factors. So before we start looking at those factors, I thought let's just take a look at really external factors, these physical clues, things that you can actually see about me. So this is a photograph of me, and you might be able to tell right away that I'm white, I'm a woman. So just immediately by looking at me, you have a very clear ability to identify my gender and my race. You might also, if you were looking very carefully, you might notice that there is a wedding ring on my left hand. So you might guess from that I'm straight, and you would be correct, although that would be a little bit of guesswork on your part because I could be a married gay woman. And you might also, based on my clothing, be able to guess my socioeconomic status. And if you were looking at the tree in the background, you might also be able to guess my religion. So these are all things that you can probably tell almost at a glance at looking at me. And what I thought was interesting about that is that a lot of these external factors that make up our identity, a lot of those factors, which is how those external factors, it's how the media and society and other people would identify me or really label me. And a lot of that, I realized, is based on my physical appearance, things that can easily be seen. So I have, so I'll apologize now for the swearing, but I have a story of when the first time that I can remember realizing that other people perceived me in a way that was different than how I perceived myself. And I was in public school, and my neighbor, who was named Bobby Kim Belcher, I will never forget her. She lived on the same street as me, and I lived in a bungalow with my parents, and she lived in a duplex with her mom. And we went to the same school. And one day, she told me at recess, and I don't remember what the context was, I have no idea why it came out of her mouth, but she called me a rich bitch. And I was shocked. I mean, first of all, shocked at the language, because I was a little kid, and those weren't words that got used around my house. And so I realize now, I'm sure she learned it from her mom. And so I don't know what the context was where that came out of her mom's house, and particularly in reference to me and my family, but I was really surprised. And I fought against that. And I remember telling her, my dad's an electrician, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. That to me didn't fit my image of what a rich person was. So I thought that was an interesting story to kind of share here as to how a lot of these external labels, we might not believe them ourselves. So other labels that I feel like the media has put on me as a white professional woman, I think that sometimes we get labeled as being boring suburbanites, a milquetoast subordinate, so someone who is very passive and timid, or the opposite. If a woman does try to speak up for herself and does have a professional leadership role, well, then she's seen as being a really aggressive bitch. And this actually came up in a class that I was teaching today, where we were talking about writing letters to the editor, and a female student actually asked me how I handled that as a woman, how I handled having people interpret any complaints that I might make or demands that I might make as me just being a bitch. And I thought that was really interesting that even today, this is still something that women need to deal with. The other problem with the media is that I've just turned 40, and there are very few middle-aged women on TV or in magazines. You either have the young virgin or the old crone, and I don't really identify with either of those images anymore, or at all. Maybe I never did. And probably the worst is that I think women are often portrayed as being passive objects and not active subjects. And so I think that these are ways that the media has tried to label me as because of some of those physical and socioeconomic characteristics that are visible in that photograph of me. And the other thing that I think is true, and so this is the one that I would agree with, is that I am very privileged. I wanted to show a video of something called the Privilege Project. I think it's called the Privilege Walk Project, but YouTube won't let me show it, so I'll just explain it. So in this project, there are a number of people who are all lined up on these horizontal lines on the floor, and they're all holding hands at the beginning. They're all at the same level, and they're asked questions. I have the questions here, 35 questions. And some questions, if you agree with the statement, you take a step forward. And other questions, if you agree, or I guess it's a statement, other statements, if you agree with that statement, you take a step backwards. And so all of the statements that involve you having a barrier, you take a step back. And all of the statements that are sort of proof that you had some privilege, you take a step forward. And so watching people move through this, and at the end, there's one woman who is way far behind. She was black, she was a woman, she was gay, and right up at the front of the line there was a young white guy. And you realize that even though they might have quote unquote the same opportunities, they're both American, so they both live in America, so technically it's the land where anything can happen. You realize that it's not equitable, really. And so I took a look at those 35 questions, and of those 35 statements, I took a step forward 20 times. I only took one step back, and that was statement number 22. If you had a job during your high school and college years, take a step back. And I worked at the library, and it was a job that I adored. So I'm not really sure, although technically it's true. Yes, I worked, and so I took that step back. I think it was a privileged job, to be honest. It was a lovely job, and one that certainly helped me later on. So I thought this was really interesting, and the experiment was interesting because at the end they interviewed the people, and everybody was uncomfortable in the experiment. The people who were way far at the back of the bus certainly felt bad, I think. The people at the front felt guilty, and they were trying to justify things. They're like, well, I came from a good household, but it wasn't perfect. Well, I have all this privilege, but I worked really hard to get where I am. And I really understand that tendency to do that, because when I look at all of these ways that I am sort of externally identified, I realize that I want to fight against all of these. I, in fact, I think I define myself in opposition to those negative stereotypes, those negative labels, or those labels that I don't want to accept as being true about myself. So when I created my Wordle, actually before I started thinking about these external factors, and I realized that instead of considering myself as being a passive person, the way that I identify myself is with all these active pursuits. I'm a kayaker, and I'm a hiker, and I'm an athlete, and I'm a competitor. And instead of identifying myself as being a subordinate follower, I've actually listed myself as being a leader on here. I don't consider myself a boring, middle-aged, middle-class professional. Instead, I consider myself to be an adventurous traveler. And so I thought that was interesting, that so many of the ways that I identified myself were in direct opposition to the ways that I think I am externally identified by folks who don't really know me. The other thing that I thought was interesting when I considered internal factors was that definitely there's been a change over time for me. Certainly in the past, I never would have considered myself a competitor or an athlete. That's something that's relatively new for me. I used to really shy away from competition, but now I embrace it. Maybe I'm getting braver in my old age. And the other thing is that I consider myself much more a Canadian now than I probably ever did before, and that's a direct result of living overseas. I think the longer I lived away from Canada, the more Canadian I became, and the more of a patriot I became. So it was interesting to see that some of these ways that I identify myself now, I wouldn't have identified myself this way at all even a few years ago. The other thing that you can maybe notice with my Wordle is that a very important part of my identification is as a teacher, and that's not just my job. I really do think that it's a way of life for me. I also consider myself to be an advocate, and much of the job of the advocate, I think, is actually educating people about values and beliefs and choices. So, as we know, these external and internal factors of identification all lead to a worldview, and worldview can be defined as how we interpret the world around us, what we believe to be true about life and maybe the purpose of life, and these beliefs and knowledges affect all of our actions and thoughts. So if we take a closer look at my attitudes, beliefs, and values and aspirations as based on how I self-identify, we can get right up close in here. And so values are standards that guide us, and they're really what we believe is right or important. And probably the most important guiding factor in my life has been hard work. And I think some of that is because I always recognized, or at least after Bobby Kim Belcher pointed it out to me, I felt very aware of the privilege that I had. All around me, I lived in an area where there were some middle-class homes, and there were some duplexes, and there were a lot of townhouses. And I remember going over to my boyfriend's house in grade 8, and he was really excited because the Christmas hampers were coming. And at that time, I didn't know what a Christmas hamper was. And when I was there, I was really shocked to find out it was a basket of food, because at my house, that was not something to get excited about, because there was always food in my house. So it was clear to me as a child even that I had a lot of privilege. And I was a little bit embarrassed about it. I think I've always been a little bit embarrassed about it. And so I've always felt that I valued hard work, that was something that it was just critical. And also this feeling of waste not, want not. So always in my family, we conserved. Nobody threw anything out. Nobody spent money foolishly. We never wasted things. We always recycled things. We always composted things. And so those were values for me, and those are values that I carry today deep in my heart. And so when I thought about belief, so what I accept as true or real, so I believe that success is perseverance and perspiration. So yes, I know that there's privilege there, but I have to believe that that my hard work has also paid off, that has something to do with it. And so that other people, even if they have greater barriers, they can, if they persevere and they try hard, they too can be successful. And I've also, my other belief is that it's my job as a human being on this planet to do more good than harm, because especially because I've been given all this privilege, that it's important that I don't squander it and that I'm not a parasite on this planet. So my attitude then is, so how I sort of react to these beliefs. So I believe that I need to pay it forward. There's nobody for me to pay it back to pay back my luck to. So all I can do is pay it forward to other people. And for me, failure wasn't an option. I was given every opportunity. So how could I possibly fail? That would have been a slap in the face to my parents and to the Creator who gave me all that luck. So for me, those two attitudes were critical. I needed to work hard, I needed to succeed, and I needed to do something that would be worthwhile for my fellow people. And maybe that's why I ended up being a teacher. So under aspiration, this was a hard one for me. So what we believe is possible for ourself, family, community, our nation. And in the end, what I decided was what I think is possible is enlightenment. My job as a teacher, my role as a community advocate, really, and the fact that I'm still taking classes today. I'm taking yoga and I'm taking this class because I want to better myself. And so I think that what I aspire to and what I think is possible for all of us is to become more and more enlightened, more and more educated, more and more aware. So all of those things that comprise worldview also affect my relationship to the land, and I think also it's a reciprocal relationship. That my relationship to the land also affects my my worldview. So here on the right, I have a couple of pictures of my camp. So in the first one, you can see our cottage on the beach there, and then the other one shows a view out to the lake. And so I'm going to tell you a little story about how this camp came to be in my family, how this piece of property came to have such an important part in my life. So my great-grandfather, my great-granddad, built this camp at a place that at the time was called Eldorado Beach, is now known as Eldorado Beach. At the time it was nothing. So he built this cabin there, but he didn't buy the land. I'm not sure why. I guess he just figured it was empty so he could have it. But then somebody bought it. And the story is that Americans bought it and kicked him out. And I always thought that it was funny because I have no idea if it's true that Americans bought it or not. But it seemed to make it that much more evil that Americans came in to Canada, like invaded and, bought this property right out from underneath them because, they're evil capitalists or something. So the legend goes that Granddad was not a happy camper about this. He was furious, and so he dismantled the camp and waited until winter, put it on a sled, and then transported it across icy Lake Superior to its current location at what is now known as Mackenzie Beach. And so he resurrected the cabin there and bought the land. And that's how it came to be situated where it is. And when great-granddad passed away, he left the property to my mother, her sister, and their cousin. And for various circumstances, the cousin and the sister needed or wanted to be bought out. So my parents had to pay these family members to sort of release their portion of the cabin. And growing up, I hated going to camp. I did not have a good relationship to the land. For me, it was a place that made my parents cranky because it cost a lot of money and it took a lot of work to maintain. And when I went, really, I just wanted to read books. I wasn't interested in playing outside. I was a real introvert. And so I didn't like camp at all. And 10 years ago, my dad passed away really suddenly. And so one of the questions for my mom was, what are you going to do with this camp? And I suggested sell it, get rid of it. You're a widow, you can't afford it. We don't have the time or energy or physical strength to take care of this thing. Get rid of it. But she said she wasn't going to do anything for a year. And I was really glad that she made that decision, because what ended up happening was that we spent that year working our tailbones off at that camp. And I think that physical labor for us was a way of coping with grief over my dad's death. And so working the land out at camp became therapy. We put in that retaining wall that you can see in the picture. We re-sided everything. We re-roofed everything. We, by hand, put in a huge stone patio that my chiropractor is still in awe over the damage that I did to my body doing that. And so we worked like devils out there, is what my mom would say. And it brought us closer together, and it gave us a sense of accomplishment and this feeling that even without my dad, we could manage. Even though we were just women, we could manage. This was before I was married. And we really bonded with that piece of land. That it's not just a piece of land to me anymore. It's something that has a real, true emotional attachment for me. And so then here comes the ethical dilemma. I'm an only child. I don't have siblings, which means my mother will be passing this piece of land off to me. But you may have noticed in my self-identity that I didn't list mother as being one of my roles because I'm childless. And so the real question is, for me, it's a concern for me, as I know I'm going to inherit this property, is it appropriate for me to sell it? Can I sell it? Could I give up something that has meant so much to me and that connects me to, feelings about my parents and my history? But if I don't, what happens to it? So that's maybe gives a piece of insight into my relationship to land, and you can see that it, the pieces of my worldview that involve working hard and paying it forward are evident there in my relationship to the land. And so I hope what you've seen in this presentation is that my identity is more than just what you can see on the surface. Thanks very much for listening.